Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gábor KISS, and I would like to talk about basic and core economic principles and how macroeconomic and macrofinancial relationships are working in the economy. So, in this presentation, I would like to talk about the relationship between households and businesses. So, in this video, I would like to talk about the relationship between households and businesses. And then, during the next video, we will see that how the financial intermediary system connects these two actors together. And after that, we will add the state and foreign actors, foreign trade to this relationship graph. So that's why we will be able to see the dynamic interactions between these actors and to highlight the importance of these dynamic interactions and to show that which rules are relevant and they are standing the test of time, we will see many different historical examples. So, first of all, if we have to see that economics is a social science, which means that some rules are core rules, so they are always working, but some of the rules will be dependent on the actual historical background, society, environment, finance, the financial sector, development, climate, technology, and so on. So practically, let's say that core rules are present with us since the ancient times, and practically, if we have to define any kind of economy, then we have to think about that. Do we have people? Do we have goods? And if we have these two variables, then we can build up something. So, last time when we had an ice age, and when this ice age was ending in 10,000 BC, then in Europe mostly mammoths were in an extinction, in a wave for extinction. The ocean levels were lower than today, but otherwise the climate started to become much more friendlier than before. This is a time period when agriculture, animal husbandry starts to become a thing, and these procedures are starting to move in with those people who were practicing these things. So, if we are looking on animals, then we can see different sheep, different goats. It can be useful, and also we can have the wheat as a core grain in the European agriculture. Okay, so our story starts in Göbekli Tepe because this was the first, we cannot say settlement because nobody lived there permanently, but that was the first archaeological site which provided evidence that people were coming together and they were running some exchange of goods and practices. So we are way ahead of Stonehenge, which is practically the other end of this procedure of movement and inflow of people and goods and animals and agriculture into continental Europe. So, what can we say about the lifestyle? What can we say about the sedentarism? And what can we say about the supply? So, Göbekli Tepe nowadays looks like this. So, it was digged out, so archaeologists find it during the 90s, and practically we can see here beautiful artwork which was created way before the Bronze Age or the Copper Age. So this is completely Stone Age or Neolithic art, what we can see here. And the lifestyle of these people were somewhere between hunter-gatherers who started to domesticate animal, and they started to do crops cultivation, but we cannot say that this is a sedentary culture because no houses were identified on site. So even water have to be transported from elsewhere to this particular place. And the archaeological evidence is that not just water, but animals, stone tools were moved here from elsewhere. So since this is way before the first written source is available for us, we can just think that what is this? Is this a place for a market? Is this a place for festival? Maybe this is the first temple, but we don't have permanent inhabitants. What is relevant for us that practically people met here and they started to exchange goods and they moved here goods. So if you would like to map up the economy of Göbekli Tepe, we can say that, yeah, people gathered here. So practically this created a temporary population center. This added the relevance of this site. But for some reasons, for 3,000 years, people met here and they exchanged goods and they had a nice time to be enjoyed here. So practically this is what we can see, that it maybe the reason of meeting here was completely different, but it has operated as a temporary economy, as a temporary market. So that's why we are starting here. And also what is relevant for us, that this location connected people with diverse environmental background. So that's why it can generate goods trade. And also what we can see here, that since they have different background, practically it means that they were able to exchange their reserves, so they were able to fine-tune their consumption, they were able to utilize their advantages, which is coming from their own environmental background. So practically, yeah, first market, what we can identify here. So after time passes, we can see that this culture started to appear everywhere in the European continent. So the pinnacle of this was Stonehenge, and we can see this linear pottery or cardinalware cultures which are emerging on the continent, who are now farmers, who are using cattle, who are cultivating wheat, peas and other plants. But still we are talking about Neolithic, so stone tools, really nice stone tools, but yeah, and they were living in long houses. But still what we can see here, that these long houses, sometimes we can find settlements, but sometimes we can find even or standalone houses. So still urbanization, there can be examples what we can find, but this is not that common. However, something happened around 3000 BC, because a new flow of people started to emerge in the European continent. This is the Bell-Beaker culture. This is funny because at the same time we can find the pyramids. We can call them Bell-Beaker culture because they left this heritage of this pottery behind them. And what we can see here, that they were highly mobile. So this is the era when they domesticated horses. This is the first proof of using wagons. They were using boats, and what we can see here also, that they had relevant settlements in many places, and practically they started to change the European culture as well, because they introduced the Indo-European languages in the continent. So it was not just other archaeological culture, but practically a completely new language as well. So this new mobility means that first of all they were able to utilize long distance trade, and it means that now mining can be a much bigger operation. So practically this is the early Bronze Age, but for having a Bronze Age you need copper and moving this copper. So this is why we can say that if you would like to study another era, then Bell-Beaker culture can be really important, because in this case geological limits will be determined by mining, and that's why long distance trade will be also determined here and there. So practically there will be fond of local trade, fond of long distance trade, because if you are able to mine copper, then you need food. If you have cattle but you need bronze tools, then you need to have some kind of trade. So practically permanent population center will be important, and they will be a thing. And also, since now we have the extended family, so practically a household, okay, here we have the labor which generates their base of consumption and reserves, but also at the same time we have a mining operation, we have a forging operation, so somehow these bronze tools have to be created from the raw copper ore, and that's why we can say that some of the reserves have to be rechanneled into these operations to create such assets which can be used later on to boost their consumption. Okay, so if we would like to define the theoretical background behind the relationship of households and corporations, we can say that what determines economic output may be the following features. We cannot, or we can extend this list until infinity, but right now today this can be relevant for us. So first of all, we need labor. So we need population. This population should be concentrated somewhere, and it should be useful as a labor force. Also, technology will determine the usage of labor and the way how this labor will be used at the end of the day. And also we should not forget that if we have a concentrated set of people, so a population center somewhere, it will also centralize consumption. So practically we will find a market for consumption goods as well. And also capital. So we need savings, and that's why if we need any kind of investments, then the financial background, or in simple economies, some kind of financial look-alike background must be created. So excessive reserves are necessary for this such capital formations, and also food supply. So without food, we don't have people, obviously. So it will be really hard to create any kind of labor or consumption concentration if we are not able to keep the people alive who are there. We need also institutions, so common beliefs, laws, which are keeping the rules of engagement simple and obvious for everybody. Okay, so how can we generalize this relation? Practically in this way. So let's say that now the concentration or set of people inside an economy will be called households. So households practically are the population here. So they are providing labor for the companies, and from the fruits of their labor they can consume, or the excessive funds can be saved as savings. These are the reserves, and they can invest these savings into corporations, and after that from this money the corporation can purchase assets, and then they can produce consumption goods for the household. So practically we can say that this is this relationship is absolutely co-dependent, and we cannot find corporations without households, so this is obvious. And from corporate point of view, what is highly relevant is the profit margin. So practically what is the difference between revenue and expenditures, and this should be positive at the end of the day, because otherwise why to run such an operation. And what is really important from financial point of view, that the technology, so the efficiency of the production, will determine practically the margin of this operation. So the other thing is, in the case of savings, that it can be a loan or it can be an owner's investment. Next time when we were talking about financial intermediaries, we will talking about this one, so don't forget it, but not today. How can we extend the actual size of the enterprise? Obviously we need other markets, so not just focusing on local consumption, but if we are able to export our goods, then practically the size of the balance sheet of the company, so this thing will be extended as well. And at the end of the day, we can, even if the margin is small, but if we can extend our operations, then the profit can be bigger. So this is when we are trying to scale up the operations. So what are the dynamic interlinkages in this economy? So first of all, if we have concentrated population somewhere, then long distance trade will be much more efficient, because it will give us concentrated demand for goods. So it will be not scattered to provide something, so it will secure the market. Population growth. It's always working hand to hand with economic output, because there is more labor force, there is more demand for goods, so there is a potentially higher output and savings, but it's always limited by agricultural constraints. So sometimes we can see that population growth stops because some agricultural constraints appears, if we are checking historical examples. Also technology, so it can focus on saving labor, or it can focus on saving raw material, but at the end of the day this can improve the profit margin of the company. And in industrial revolutions, this can be a self-reinforcing wave of technology developments and profit margin increases. Okay, what is relevant for us, that in Western economies labor is the rare input. So we should not forget that since the medieval time periods, there were no slaves in the European market. Okay, we can find examples sometimes in the fringes of the European continent. So Vikings prefer to collect slave people and to sell slave people, or sometimes we can find the examples also in the Eastern or for example we can find the example in Byzantium, or also in the Mediterranean Sea. There were also cases when corsairs and other pirates collected people for with slavery motivation, but otherwise, so the labor was always rare input, so that's why slavery was practically not an option, because in this case, if you have an economy which is focusing on using slaves, then it means that this is an input which is available already, and it's not a rare thing. It's you are full of labor force. Okay, and price dynamics. So practically it means that if the consumption demand is bigger than the actual produced goods, then obviously prices will increase, so we will have an inflation. If produced goods are bigger and the consumption is smaller, then obviously you try to find your market niches. So you start to decrease the prices, so there can be a deflation on the market. Okay, and now let's see that how sensitive this simple model to external shocks. So first of all, I talked a lot about the relationship between population and labor force, but what happens if the population decreases? So practically we can have the Justinian plague in the mid 6th century, which actually met or which was combined with the volcanic winter of the same decades, which meant that practically they combined the Jasonian pestis, the Gothic and Vandal wars around the Mediterranean Sea, and many years without any real summer. So we can see the temperature graph from the Wikipedia that practically dropped a lot suddenly. So the population decline was really serious. So practically 40 million people remained on the whole European continent. So nowadays it's around 800 million people. So we can say this is a really serious decline, which means that the whole economic background started to collapse. So cities depopulated, already tax revenues were insufficient in the previous century already, and now the Western Roman originated public administrations, which were kept somehow operational by the barbarian kingdoms as well, now it is falling to pieces. So you are not able to, they were not able to maintain it, and this was also supporting the introduction of these feudal systems because they were much more robust. So if we are looking on the rural-urban economic relations, we can say that, yeah, around the birth of Christ, so 1 CE, practically we can see that 11% or 13% was the ratio of the whole European continent from the global population, according to the Madison database. And so this is already not a lot of people. So if we are halving this up, then we can find a really serious decline. And what happens in this case when this population collapses? So we can assume that, okay, there was some kind of relationship between smaller towns which are aggregating the food and raw material supply of the nearby villages, and then they are moving these goods to the relevant cities, and then they are taking back the processed clothes, textile products, and so on, and after that they deliver this to the villages. So practically if we are adding plague, war and famine to this equation, then it means that so village population, okay, we can have it, but the problem will be that if we are stressing this enough, or for example when the town is destroyed by the combination of these three disasters, practically there will be no demand for villages goods anymore. So they just have to focus on self-sustenance because they lost their market completely, because the population, the demand here and there disappeared. So this is the reason why cities became really small in continental Europe. So we are talking about a really small set of cities already at that time, and we are talking about just 1,000 or 2,000 of people in these cities. Okay, but what happens if the population is growing? So after these really dark centuries, agricultural revolution started in the 900s in Western Europe, which meant that population started to increase, but we have serious constraints here because wheat has a really poor yield ratio. So in poorer territories, the yield was from 1 seed, they were able to get 4 seeds. If they get in the better soils or areas, they were able to increase this yield to 1 to 10. At the same time, if you are looking on China or Central America, according to the Braudel database and book, we can find 1 to 30 or 1 to 40 ratio. So it means that you need much more area to sustain the same amount of people. So this is an upper constraint for growth. So even at the peak time periods in the high medieval era, Paris had the population of 100,000 people. So this is not so much people compared to the 1 million people cities in China or in Central America. So yield is really important, what happens with the main grain. And they were already able to increase these levels because they introduced these 2 or 3 field systems, the moldboard plow and the house collars and horseshoes. So practically they introduced new technology in the agriculture. New technology to utilize horses, new technology to move the soil around, and new technology to utilize the already existing land. What happens in this case that with the increase of the population, again the division of labor started to increase. So specialization, now it was worth to do so. So we can find city-states. They started to pop up, especially in the Holy Roman Empire. We can find reappearing emergent urban hierarchies. So there are towns which are for agricultural distribution again, and we can find cities which much more focusing on industry and long distance trade, and also we can find a population expansion because of the poor yield. So a lot of people move to the Baltics, a lot of people move to Central Europe. So most of Central European and Eastern Central European cities were founded by settlers from German territory or French or Italian territory. So it's really interesting that how this dynamics works. And they created concentrated demand. So specialization in manufactured goods, guilds were created, but this is also a linear, slow growth. So this is not an exponential growth inside the economy. These economies are growing, but according to a linear trend. That's why still for these people it looks like as a zero-sum game. So that's why they are trying to mitigate the risk of over expanding by creating such guilds and other monopolies, oligopolies to limit the growth of the supply. And trade channels, so we can see that, okay, food and raw materials were traded for finished goods. This is a local market. We can find continental trade when they move the relevance. In this case, still we can find bulk goods, we can find higher value goods, and also on the top of this cake there are the luxuries, so global trade, how they participated. And in this case, if we are looking on the map, then we can identify different product categories. So some in some cases we can find centers or territories or regions where many cities popped up within short time periods. So northern Italy, or here in eastern Germany, or nowadays northern Germany, or nowadays northern Poland. So that was Hanseatic League or the Low Countries. So there were highly urbanized territories which were concentrating the trade, which were connecting the whole European continent to the global trade networks, and also which were the hubs of the continental trade as well. So we can see that, for example, soap manufacturing, importing raw materials of soap manufacturing, importing wool from the British Islands and then manufacturing it to clothes and textiles was concentrated in the Low Countries, or for example importing high quality iron from India, which was referred as Damascus steel, through the Middle East, then processing fancy weapons and armors in northern Italy, or for example importing tar and timber from the Baltics, or moving grain and then manufacturing beer from it, or for example, which is highly relevant, gold from Ghana, because the external trade balance of the continent was in a huge deficit. So practically there was a constant gold outflow, and half of this gold demand was coming from sub-Saharan territories. At this time they had no idea where it's come, because it was just moving through by trade to the continent. So only the other half of the gold mining was coming from the continent at that time. So it created a constant gold hunger as a result of the trade deficit. And what are the growth constraints? So first of all, food. If the crop yield is poor and low, then it limits the population, both labor and both consumers. Timber was another limiting factor, because if you are using timber for construction, heating and iron smelting as a resource, then you will be the subject of the recovery of this renewable resource. And moving bulk goods, in this case you have just waterways. If you have wide enough and good enough rivers, if you have seas, if you have big enough lakes, then you can move bulk goods. But in this case, mostly the maritime areas will be linked into the division of labor and into the world economy practically at that time. And also, logistics and infrastructure will determine the information transmission. So at that time, sending a letter from the Mediterranean Sea to Paris, it was taking 2 months sometimes. So this is a really, really slowly operating economy, what we can find here in the medieval time periods. And there is no centralized state administration, or this centralization is not so professional at that time. So practically this feudal state was coming from 3 estates: clergy, nobles, and bourgeois and peasants. So practically the institutional background was really poor. So if we are thinking about that, how the corporate sector and the commerce was able to increase, so these growth factors were limited by these features. Okay, but we talked about rapid population declines, rapid slow and but steady population increases. But what happens if the similar or nearly the same population decline happens after this increased activity? So Yersinia pestis came back, practically the same bacteria came back in 1356 into Europe, and again half of the population was lost within several months. So what will be the difference? Because last time when it happened, then everything collapsed, cities, trade, society, everything. But now we are combining it with the feudal state, and practically there is a constant stream of local and regional military conflicts. So if we are thinking about the time, then we can mention the 100 years war between France and England. There are the continuous wars on the Italian peninsula between the different city-states, back and forth. We can find civil wars, like what will happen with the Wars of Roses in Great Britain later on. So this is a highly militaristic society. That's why we can find that from century to century, practically the equipment of the knights and practically the military class will develop a lot. So this is a highly innovative time period. And also the feudal state creates some kind of stability, or at least it defines the background. But also, if we are going at the level of the different monarchies, different countries, then we can say we can find different setups. So this is a highly diverse society from an institutional point of view. And the reason why there were no such a collapse like before, that first of all, the king, so whole kingdom altogether had a mixed stream of revenue. So first of all, okay, they collected some taxes in money, but also revenues were coming also from personal property, and also the size of the budget was really narrow because there were no central or local public administration. So the whole continent was a loose network of feudal estates, villages, towns here and there, cities, the royal estates, or estates of the noble people, but practically the cohesion was not so strong to create such a collapse. If the king died, then died. There will be some inheritance, maybe there will be a war due to this inheritance, but this is a really simple and really robust economy. So what can happen if the population decreases at the level of the rural territories? So as I mentioned already, that wheat and barley has the really good. So wheat and barley had really terrible yield. Practically it meant that as the population increased, they needed more and more fields to produce wheat and barley to sustain the already existing population. Which meant that practically if the soil was poorer, still you needed the output of these fields as well. So if we have this imaginary village with roads to the neighboring towns, with some hills, rivers, and all these wheat and barley fields which are necessary to survive until the next summer, what happens if half of the population disappears? So practically it means that, first of all, labor costs will increase. So it will be more expensive to hire people because it disappeared. So second thing, because we have now half of the population, practically we can say that, okay, let's use the less resourceful territories to raise other kind of crops. So for example, let's say that, okay, we need industrial resources, so flax and hops will be produced here, because from flax you can create textiles, from hops you can create beer. Or you can say that let's rent this out. Maybe the villages will pay for that, so as a noble person I don't have to care about this anymore. I will have a nice steady stream of revenues anyway. Or I can say that flax and hops can be much more labor intense, so since it's expensive, so let's focus on keeping sheep, cattle there, so pasturing can be, because it's less labor intensive. Or in many cases we were able to see that landlords started to focus on investing into their estates. So let's have windmill, or let's have a water mill for grinding, sewing, textile preparation purposes, because in this case these services can also generate some revenues. So maybe their tenants, their peasants, are not paying anymore because they are dead, but renting out land, building new service buildings can reinforce the stream of revenues, and practically also it can diversify the stream of revenues. And also now this can create a new source of supply for towns, for cities, as a raw material. So if we can see that sheep industry or sheep business is coming up in the villages, then now we should focus much more on textile production than before. Or they can, for example, build a bridge and also providing faster infrastructure services. So There are many different ways, but practically what we can learn from today's video is about two things: population and companies. In the case of population, we can see that this agricultural or climate and healthcare constraints are really important. So we are living on this planet, and if something is happening with this planet, then it will limit our lives as well. Next thing, labor force constraints. So we can play with technology. So if we are thinking about this one, so we don't need so much human intervention in a windmill, because practically all the grindings or the work will be done by the wind power or by water power, and people need there to move the goods around, to organize things here, to regulate the operations, but not for putting physical force into the effort of this procedure. So, so technology can compensate labor force constraints in many cases. Also, concentration, so creating a market, it can be a really important feature. Ability to save, and this is why we will start to think about this during the next video, because practically if they are able to save some money, save some resources, then this can be the basis of forming capital investments. So this is can back channel, and this can provide an additional feedback loop for increasing economic growth. At this time period, during the medieval times, it was a slow procedure, a linear growth, but even after, so even before the Industrial Revolution, maritime economies started to have exponential growth. Once this ability to save, and also once their ability to conduct long distance trade was an open opportunity for them. Because companies can have, or do they need inputs, so raw material, labor force. With technology they can improve this, or one or two, the utilization of this relationship. It will have an impact on their profit margin, and practically their efficiency can be increased. So how the profit is related to the number of employed people. And as a result, their output can be traded locally, regionally, or in the continental markets. So logistics and infrastructure will be really important, and also that's why financial background will be relevant for us during next time. And this is why we have to talk about the state, because state has a really important feature in the case of to deal with or to mitigate the agriculture and healthcare constraints, and also to prepare the labor force to deal with more advanced technology, and also to deal with infrastructure, to provide better infrastructure to reinforce logistics. And of course we have to talk about trade networks as well, so how trade networks during the Bronze Age, around 1000, and of course during the industrial era and before the industrial era developed themselves, because trade networks, global trade networks, are really old structures, and usually they have also common characteristics. Until next time.